Good evening. Welcome to our another iteration of our Bible study, a study in the Word that we've called God's Big Story of the Bible. And for the benefit of those who may be joining this study for the first time, I just want to just kind of give a brief kind of review of why we call it God's Big Story and the direction in which we're headed. Most people, unfortunately, view the Bible through the lens of just the collection of inspirational stories and characters that we, learned going all the way back to our Sunday school days. And most people do not realize that the Bible is so much more than that, that the Bible is actually one book that tells one big story, which is the story of redemption. The Bible is like a novel. For instance, it has a beginning, it has a climax, and in the middle it has the body, which tells you how you got from the beginning to that climax. And the Bible is very similar. And all of those famous inspirational characters that we've known to grow and love, from back in our Sunday school days, they're actually just one piece of the puzzle of God's big story. And the story is ultimately God's big story of redemption. And we've talked about, in our first class, that after the fall of man, God could have made a decision, just like he did, we're going to be discussing tonight at the flood of Noah. He could have wiped out everybody, and he could have wiped out Adam and Eve and started all over from scratch. But instead, he chose to embark upon a plan of redemption and restoration that will eventually and ultimately bring humanity back into right relationship with him, and to restore not only humanity but the planet back to that original perfect state that he found that was there when he initially created the heavens and the earth, and before sin entered into the scene. So that's why we're calling this study God's Big Story. And we talked about also that we're going to be doing this study in two parts. We're going to be looking at, which we started basically last week, God's big story of the Old Testament. And then I might take a little break, and then I'm going to come back and share a study on God's big story of the New Testament. And the approach that we're taking is that we're going to be looking at these studies, or looking at the idea or the concept of God's big story from the vantage point or of a chronological and historical overview, and not necessarily going verse by verse by verse through the scriptures and through the book, because that would take quite a long time, as you would all, I'm sure, realize. But we're going to be looking at certain keys, certain principles that we can understand, that will help us to understand the big story or the big picture of the Bible. And I believe, and I'm a firm believer in this, that if we can grasp the big story, the overarching story that God is trying to tell through the Old and New Testament, then we'll be able to understand those smaller components much more comprehensively as we go forward. Now, going back last week, we began our study to more specifically to examine the big story of the Old Testament. And we began this journey by pointing out that there are 11 Old Testament books that we refer to as foundational books. And the reason why we call these 11 books foundational books is because, as you very well know, or most of you should know, that the chronological or the canon of the Old Testament scripture, in other words, the order or the sequence in which the Old Testament books are given to us in our current canon, are not all in the historical or chronological order, or in the order in which the events actually transpire. But there are 11 books that are in their actual historical and chronological order, and we're going to be examining the Old Testament through the lens of these 11 books. And those 11 books, as we pointed out last week, are Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, Ezra, and Nehemiah. And why do we call these foundational books? Well, these 11 books give us the historical and chronological big picture storyline of the entire Old Testament. And as we go through this, it's going to become much more clear as we go through, and you'll begin to see exactly where we're going for the benefit of those who are just joining us for the first time. Now, in addition, the 11 foundational books, or more specifically, I would like to say that the 11 foundational books tell the chronological big story of the 7 periods of Israel's history. And that's really what you're going to be able to see and examine. There are 7 actual identifiable periods in the history of the nation of Israel that are told by these 11 foundational books. And those 7 periods, again, for the benefit of those who weren't with us or joining us for the first time, those 7 periods are the formation period. Why do we call it the formation period? Because God promised Abraham that a man who was up in age, who had no children, that he was going to make his seed a great nation. So it had to start with God forming a nation. And of course, that narrative begins with Abraham and the patriarchs, and we'll get into that in more detail. But that's period number 1, the formation period. God, he has to form a nation. That's the first thing. You can't do any of the other promises until he forms a nation, because he promised Abraham that I will make you a great nation. So we're calling this first period the period of formation. And then the second period is known as the theocracy period. We call it the theocracy period because it simply means God's rule. In other words, God ruled the people. Now that they officially became a nation, God ruled over them through the priests and the judges. And so we call the book of Judges that period of the Judges, rather, the period of theocracy. And the word theocracy, it just simply means God's rule. And technically, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but the period of the Judges actually runs through from the death of Joshua up until 1 Samuel chapter 7, because Samuel was actually the final or the last of the judges. And of course, we see a great transition in 1 Samuel chapter 8 and 7, and we'll unpack it in more depth when we get to that point. But just I want to quote this one verse in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 7. And the Lord said to Samuel, heed to the voice of the people, for they have not rejected you. They have rejected me, that I shall not rule over them. So keep that verse in mind, that I shall not rule over them. That's why we call that the theocracy period, or God rule, because during that span of time that lasted 332 years, God was actually ruling over them through the priest and also through the judges. The next period that immediately followed was a period known as the United Kingdom period. And it's referred to as the United Kingdom period because in all 12 tribes, the entire kingdom, the entire nation was under the leadership of one king. And during that period of time, we had 3 kings, each of whom served their kingship for 40 years. And that was Saul, David, and then Solomon. And that period runs from 1 Samuel 8 and 1, and it ends in First Kings 11 and 43. And then they transition to the 4th period in their history, which is the divided kingdom period, where it became divided because it became 2 nations. It became the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom became Israel, and the southern kingdom was Judah. And from this point on, and it's during this particular period, as a matter of fact, that the large number of the writing prophets ministered. And one of the things that's very important to kind of keep in mind, and I'm going to really unpack it when we get to this point, but I'm just kind of just laying it out there for now. And that is that whenever we get into the writing prophets who ministered during this period, or during the period of the divided kingdom, all of their letters and all of their instructions from the Lord began with Son of Man, or or call up the prophet, go minister to Israel, and say, go minister to Judah. And that's very important, because sometimes we try to interpret or try to preach and teach from the prophets, and we just kind of like, have an overarching, like perception of really what's being said. But the truth of the matter is that Israel, the north, 10 tribes to the north, and Judah, after they split, their histories went in completely opposite direction. Primarily because the northern 10 tribes, in their entire history until they were taken into captivity, never had a godly king. In other words, every one of the kings that served in the northern kingdom of Israel after the split they all did evil in the sight of the Lord. And the southern kingdom of Judah got a little bit of a reprise, a little bit of a grace period before they were also eventually taken into captivity. But they had 5 godly kings, and then they had 2 other kings that were kind of so-so, but which would have been better than anything that the northern kingdom had. So then you had the 5th period in the kingdom of the nation of Israel, the 5th period, and that is the single kingdom period. Because after 2 Kings 17, you don't hear any other mention of the 10 northern tribes for the remainder of the Old Testament. They're gone off the scene because they're taken into captivity by the Assyrians. And of course, I always like to insert a pin here, because it was during that time, or prior to that time, where Jonah was sent by God to minister to Nineveh, which happened to be the capital city of Assyria, and he did not want to go. And we all know the story, and we'll unpack it there. But that was another one of those puzzle pieces that we're gonna fit in and see how that story actually fits into the big picture. Because actually, Jonah got a bad rap, so we're going to point that out. We're going to deal with that as we get to it. But the final 2 periods, and that is period 6, was the period of captivity. In other words, the southern kingdom of Judah, as prophesied by the prophet Jeremiah, was taken into captivity by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, and they remained in captivity for 70 years. And at the conclusion of that 70-year period, they were released from Babylon, and by a decree signed by their new king, who was Cyrus of Persia, because the Persians had taken won a victory over the Babylonian Empire on the night of the handwriting in the wall, on that particular night. And that particular night marked the end of the Babylonian Empire and the beginning of the Persian Empire. And their first king was Cyrus the Great. And he wrote a decree allowing the Jews, the captive Jews, to return, just as prophesied, to return back to their homeland, and rebuild the city and rebuild the temple that had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. So the 11 foundational books tell the story of the 7 periods of Israel history. And I just want to make one quick note also before I move on, is that you'll see some professors and some scholars, they'll take the middle 3 periods, to unite it, divide it in a single kingdom period, and just make it all one and just call it the kingdom periods. And so they'll show charts that'll just say the kingdom period. It'll be 5, but I don't really care for that, because these are 3 distinct periods, and that are distinctly identified in Scripture. And I think it's more revealing when you divide it and just let your students know exactly the difference, and why there should be a distinguishing between these 3 periods. So that's the reason why I build them out into 7 periods as opposed to 5, like some professors like to do. Now, with that being said, we're going to resume our study, because we began to unpack the first foundational book of Genesis last week. And of course, we talked about how Genesis is the book of beginnings. It was the beginning of so many things that we know, the beginning of family, the beginning of sin, the beginning of prophecy, and so forth. And so we unpacked that last week. And we also talked about the fact that the book of Genesis is divided up into two divisions. You have, first of all, Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 11, which comprises a period of about 2,000 years. And then let me just pause right there. You need to really think for a moment, because God gives us 2,000 years of history in the first 11 chapters, because it's almost as though he wanted us to give us a big basic overview, how the world became the way that it is, just so he can hurry up and get to the big story, which begins in Genesis chapter 12 with the call of Abraham. So now the prehistory is told in these first 11 chapters, and these first 11 chapters describe 4 events that shaped the world as we currently know it. And those 4 events, and we got into the first one last week, was creation, and we unpacked the fall, and then there's the flood, and then the chapter 11 concludes with the events surrounding the Tower of Babel. And so that's the 4 distinct events that are described in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, that shaped the world. In other words, it answers the question, why is the world the way that it is now? Why is there so much evil in the world? Why is there so many different cultures and languages in the world? And many other questions such as that. Why is the topography of the earth formed the way that it is? And so that's what we're going to be getting into tonight, by the way. So as we move forward, part 2 of the book of Genesis, from Genesis chapter 12 all the way through chapter 50, is the story of the patriarchs, beginning with Abraham, and then Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And remember, we said we were dealing with a formation period, so God has to form a nation. So from Genesis 12 all the way to the end of the Old Testament, or the book of Malachi, is about 2,000 years. So we're moving forward. That's just a 2-part breakdown, a 2-part division of the book of Genesis. So now we're going to pick up tonight with our last week we talked about the creation and the fall. And if I won't go back and deal with any of that. If you weren't with us, you can go back and watch that video, and you kind of catch up to where we are. But tonight we're going to pick up with Genesis chapter 6 and Noah's Ark and the Great Flood. And I just need to stick a pin right here just for a moment, because what I decided to do, my initial intention was to get all the way through the flood narrative tonight in one night. But as I was preparing for tonight's study, I realized that it was just too much that I wanted to share, and that I wanted to unpack. That it's going to probably take me 2 lessons in order to completely finish and unpack what I want to discuss in the events that surrounds the Noah's Ark story. Now, I said that, and also I want to point out is that one of the reasons why is just so much, because I decided to go a different route than what's normal, or what maybe many of you may be accustomed to, because I'm pretty sure that everybody listening to this are very familiar with the story of Noah and the ark, and how Noah built the ark, and he brought the animals on 2 by 2, meant 1 male, 1 female, and only Noah and his family were safe. So we basically know the basic story. But there are some things about the story of Noah and the ark that I'm just going to put it out there right now, that we did not learn in Sunday school, that most of us didn't. At least I know for sure that I most certainly didn't. And so I decided to just kind of take some time, because what I decided I want to do tonight, as it relates to Noah and the ark, and the great flood story, is I wanted to deal with some things that most of us generally have not been taught, and some things that we have not learned in Sunday school. And I want to spend time talking about why the flood, the specifics. Now, the Bible tells us that there was evil everywhere, but we want to know specifically. So we're going to take a look, and we're going to examine and explore specifically why God sent the flood in the first place. And so we're gonna just begin to unpack that. Now, as we go forward, as we look into the flood story, as it begins, actually the flood story, the flood narrative runs from Genesis chapter 6 all the way through chapter 9. And then we go into the Tower of Babel narrative. But we just want to look at the third event of prehistory that is recorded in the first 11 chapters of the Genesis is the flood of Noah's day. And now I want to look at some general facts about the flood of Noah. I want to spend a couple minutes just looking at some general facts. Many of these general facts, most of you probably already know, and then there may be some that you may not know. But I'm going to then we're going to really kind of like dive into some things that just to kind of challenge your mind and just to make you think a little bit. All right. So now, of the general fact, the first one is the account of the flood of Noah's day. First of all, reveals the global extent of human corruption that existed at the time of the flood. I'm going to repeat that. The global extent of the human corruption that existed at the time of the flood. Now, most of you have, that you've heard that because, God, it repented God that he created man in the first place. That's how bad it was. But how did it get to that point? How did it get to that extent? What happened specifically? And that's what we're going to dive into. Spend a large portion of tonight's class pointing out and talking about. Now, I'm not even sure I'll get through it all. I may have to pick that narrative up next week, but we'll see as we go. Second, the story of, and this is very powerful right here. The story of the ark foreshadows a divine pattern. Let me repeat that. The story of the ark foreshadows a divine pattern of salvation in the midst of judgment and for a future and much greater redemption. So I just want to just sit that there. I just want to just kind of allow you to just kind of meditate on what we're saying here, because when you compare the word foreshadows, meaning that it's a type of, and a type of what? Type of a future redemption that's going to come to believers when the tribulation occurs. And that foreshadowing is, by most scholars' estimate, is going to be the rapture. But we're going to unpack that later. Now, the flood brought about enormous geological change. In other words, not only did it have like spiritual components in terms of foreshadowing, future redemption and the pattern of salvation of Noah and his family, how Noah and his family was saved from God's judgment. And that's what we're saying here. But the flood brought about, in addition to that, an enormous geological changes to the topography of the earth, to the point that the world today is not what the world originally looked like. In other words, the flood narrative explains precisely why the topography or the geography of the earth became configured the way that it is today. And so we're going to see how that's going to be big here just in a moment. Now, also, just some other nuggets, that things that you may be aware of already. Most of you, I would imagine. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights, but not just rain. And here's the part that's kind of one of those mini nuggets that most of us probably didn't learn in Sunday school. Not just rain, but the Bible says in Genesis 7:11 that the fountains of the deep were broken up, signifying that the eruption of subterranean waters from the opening of the earth's crust poured into, in addition to the waters that was coming down. So it wasn't just rain. In other words, it was water coming down, and it was also the waters from beneath the earth coming up, which caused the great flood. So that's important to keep in mind as well as we go through this narrative. Now, remember, in addition, along with that, because we gotta kind of take a little bit, go back for a moment back to creation day number 3, and we talked about that 2 weeks ago. But But check, just remember this. Remember that on day 3 of the creation week, God gathered the waters. Remember, we talked about that. God gathered the waters into one place, revealing dry land. This land is called earth, and he gathered the waters that he called that seas. Now that's something that we're aware, but paying close attention to the text in the creation account in Genesis 3. I'm sorry, in Genesis 1 on day 3, God gathered the waters into one place. Now, if you recall, that the pre-flood world had a watery canopy. Remember, we called it a firmament. He says, put a firmament around the earth. And that firmament caused a greenhouse effect that probably provided a warmer and more stable global climate, number one. But it also protected a lot of the harmful radiation that came from the sun. Now, it's important to note that there's a reason, because most people, we kind of look and we read the Bible and we kind of take for granted the fact that prior to the flood, the humans were the lifespans, even after the fall, human lifespans were just an enormous, like it was nothing for some people, someone to live 400, 700, 800 years before they died. And that had a large part because this greenhouse effect or the firmament that protected the earth. And many theologians and scholars and historians believe that this firmament pretty much had the entire globe at a basic temperature that kept the earth basically like a blanket around the earth. And so that's really interesting. But once that blanket was removed, because remember, during the flood, those 40 days and 40 nights, that the water was coming below and from above. And once that was removed, you began to see the lifespan, generation after generation after generation, the lifespans of humanity gradually began to decline. And most scholars, again, believe that had a lot to do with now humanity no longer had the benefit of the effects that they were receiving prior to the flood of that canopy that was around the earth, or that firmament that was protecting them and making the global climate at a constant temperature. And I want to also point out again, and I mentioned this, when we discussed the creation week, that it's a good reason why we need to have a biblical worldview. In other words, we need to let God be true and every man a liar, because the world is telling us that having a greenhouse effect is bad. Having a greenhouse effect is going to destroy the planet. That's what politicians are trying to tell us. That's what governments are trying to tell us. But God said the greenhouse effect was good. So he looked at his creation after day 3 and looked around and said, this is good. And then when everything was all said and done, everything was all said and done, not only did he say it was good, but then he concluded by saying it's very good. So the world is saying that the greenhouse is bad, but God said it was very good. And so I believe that we as believers need to believe God rather than man. That's the reason why, again, we need to have, do studies like this, and so that we can better defend our faith and why we believe what we believe. And of course, it is a graphic of that greenhouse effect, because I showed this earlier, but this is kind of how it looked. There was a subterranean waters, and then there was also this water canopy called the firmament that was above the earth. And so during the course of the flood period of those 40 days, this water canopy began to unleash down from above, and these waters below unleashed from below. And this is the reason why we had a great global flood. Now before the great flood, and this is another important nugget, a piece of information, that the earth is often depicted as having a single or large landmass, so many of you may have heard of this term called Pangea, which was surrounded by a single ocean. And this, it was basically called a supercontinent, which would have later broken apart due to the flood's forces forming the continents as we know it today. So remember, one of the things that was by the flood, what we learned from the study or the narrative of the flood, is that why is the continents shaped and configured the way that they are today? Why that's another one of those whys that's answered in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. Now, here's an artist, not a rendition of what some historians, some scholars, some Bible scholars believe that that supercontinent may have looked like, and there are reasons why this is strongly believed by many. And I'm just going to show you one example. But if you can just examine, if you can look at where these how these joints are fit together, these land masses fit together, and then examine this and what we have here, and you can see it here on the left image, but on this one in particular, you can see on the right, you can see it in more detail, is that the eastern coast of South America and the western coast of Africa is clear when you look at it on the map, was once one mass that was all one. I mean, it's almost irrefutable once you really pay close attention to it. And so that's just kind of letting us know that the flood of Noah not only had an impact on killing everyone who was evil except Noah and his family and that entire narrative, and God basically started over. And of course, there's some other things that was involved with that we're going to be unpacking as well. But you can see that the topography of the earth was also impacted by the flood of Noah. Now, we're going to just run through, and I know that was kind of long, but I just kind of, because I'm trying to get somewhere in particular, but I want to just share some additional facts about the flood of Noah. First, the flood was worldwide, and of course, that's a debate by many scholars. Many well-meaning and well-known Bible scholars believe that the flood was just local, primarily centered in the Middle East area, for instance. And of course, that is really, in my estimation, have been really debunked through geology, through science, and through geology, through discoveries over the years. That's really could not have been the case. The evidence is overwhelming, and we're going to talk about that maybe more next week. But the evidence is overwhelming that the flood was worldwide. And then only Noah and his family and 2 of every animal were saved in the ark, which is common knowledge. But nearly 300, and this is amazing. I threw this up here, but I'm gonna not talk about it that much, because when we get to the Tower of Babel narrative, I'm going to really dive into this, because there's nearly 300 cultures around the world having legends of a catastrophic flood in their histories. Now, how could that have been? So that's what we're going to impact. So it's not just the Bible, not just the Jews and the Hebrews and the Christians who had a flood story, but their flood story. They're Babylonian, Assyrian, Egyptian, even in the North Americas, the Incas. They all had flood legends that and basically tell the same story. And we'll talk about that. We'll point that out, because that's going to be when we get into the Tower of Babel narrative. That's going to be a significant component that we're going to dive into. Now, Noah's great grandfather Enoch, and I want you to circle that name. Write that name down. Enoch is one of only 2 people in Scripture that never died, and Enoch was Noah's grandfather. Why is Enoch matter? We'll find out here in just a moment. And then the Scripture tells us in Genesis 5:20-24, and Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. So he was 300 years old when he had Methuselah. And the reason why I stuck this in there, one of the reasons, is that it's interesting, because the name Methuselah, it was prophetic, because God had already given to Enoch, that there was going to be a great flood. And Methuselah his name literally means after it is sent, he shall die. That's literally what his name meant. He shall die after it is sent, meaning the flood. I mean, no, I'm sorry. I said that wrong. After he is gone, it shall occur. Talking about the flood. In other words, after Methuselah dies, it shall occur. And almost immediately, within days or weeks after Methuselah died, the flood happened. And so Methuselah is just an example of God's grace, because he was allowing grace even back then, even in the midst of all of that wickedness. And so, but we're gonna talk about that more as we go forward. Also, now there were giants that were responsible for the global corruption, and this is kind of where we're gonna be talking about for the balance of today's lesson. We're going to get into that narrative. And then the waters prevailed 150 days in total, meaning that that Noah was actually inside the ark for 377 days and 5 months just floating, and then 7.5 months as he landed on the top of Mount Ararat and waited for the waters to recede. So that's some basic info. And then, of course, now I want to also backtrack and deal with this a little bit. Like, according to biblical genealogies, Noah's flood occurred 1,656 years after creation. And that number comes as a result of chapters 4 and 5 in describing prehistory sequences of events and genealogies. And oftentimes, it can be boring. I can remember from years and years ago, it can be boring reading about genealogies in scripture, and so begot so-and-so, and so begot so-and-so, and this one begot that one, and had sons and daughters. But there's a reasons why God included those genealogies in scriptures, in scripture. And we're going to see that over and over again. And we're going to see that the reasons are going to be uniform throughout, because we want to make sure and confirm and verify the things that are being taught, or that he is doing in the world. And he also wanted to make sure that you remember the ultimate goal is going to bring and give birth to the Messiah. And the Messiah had to come down through a specific line. And so that line had to be clearly identified in order for the Messiah to be born. And also, for once we get into the New Testament time, that family lineage had to be clearly identified in order for the Jews to even begin to think about accepting Jesus as their Messiah, because he had to specifically come through the line of Abraham and through David. And that had to happen. And so that's one of the reasons why it's important to pay attention to genealogies. But in this particular instance, we get some interesting information from Adam to Noah. From Adam to Noah's flood was 1,656 years. And we know that through the genealogies that we have here on the screen, and I won't read them all, but I wanted to jump down to Enoch being 65 years begat Methuselah. Methuselah at the age of 187 begat Lamech, and Lamech being 182 begat Noah. And also one little notation I want to make about Methuselah. Of course, he was the longest recorded human back in that time that we have on record. And remember that his name meant after he is gone, it shall be sent. After he is gone, it shall be sent. The that shall be sent is referring to the flood of Noah. So in other words, it's referring to God's judgment. And as I believe that God allowed Methuselah to live as long as he did, over 900 years, simply because he was providing grace. That was another example of God's grace. Just like we're living now, we're in the age of grace. And so it's a lot of parallels there that we'll see. And so all total, Noah at the coming of the flood, which appears in the 7th chapter of Genesis, the whole sum of years is 1,656. Now, with all of that little kind of a background out of the way, I got about another 20 minutes here, and we're going to get out of here. And then I will just pick up next week, because I really wanted to. I don't want to rush through this. But Genesis 6 begins with the account of the unholy union between the sons of God and the daughters of men. And so we're going to be examining who these sons of God are. And this is something that, again, I talked about how, there are things about this flood narrative that most of us did not learn in Sunday school. At least I most certainly didn't. And so we're gonna examine some things, and I'm gonna say some things and point out some things and show some things here that is gonna, maybe for some of you may be familiar with, and others of you, maybe you may be hearing this for the first time. But don't trip out on me. Don't say, oh, this is a heretic. I mean, he's gone out of scripture. No, just follow along, and you're going to see that everything is going to line up just right. Now, so let's take a look at Genesis, the first two verses in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 1 says, and I want you to pay very close attention to the language that's being used. And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth. And I want you to kind of like do a screenshot or something of this particular verse, or mark this or highlight this particular verse, the words that men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, because that's going to be significant going forward. That the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and that they took them wives of all which they chose. Now, first of all, we're going to have to unpack and talk about precisely who were these sons of God. And of course, this is something that's controversial even among scholars. And I want to just for the sake of fairness, that there are those, even some well-meaning scholars, who believe that the sons of God is a reference to the descendants of Seth, or they call them the Sethites, and they were supposed to be, they refer to them as the godly line. Well, there's so many different reasons why that's just can't possibly be true, even though there's some well-meaning scholars and professors that they'll die on that hill. But there's no way that can be true, just from the narrative itself, which says that everybody, the whole world was evil except Noah and basically his family. So there was no godly line other than Noah and his family. So just that alone, plus many other reasons that we're going to unpack here and just going forward the rest of this class and probably starting out next week as well, why it can't possibly be. So who were these sons of God? The sons of God were supernatural beings. They were members of the heavenly hosts who transgressed the boundaries of heaven and earth with disastrous effects. Now, I want to do a deep dive into this here in the next few moments, and then pick it up next week. But the sons of God were referred to, and they're mentioned in the book of Daniel, and they're also mentioned in another book that I was kind of holding off trying to mention or reference rather, because I know oftentimes when I reference this particular book that I get some raised eyebrows, I'm just going to hold off just for a moment to kind of keep you wondering. But now, first of all, in the Hebrew language, these words "sons of God" means in Hebrew it means or it's pronounced B'nai Elohim, B'nai Elohim. And generally, when this expression of B'nai Elohim is used in scripture, it is almost always, a matter of fact, not even almost, but it's only one exception. And there's a New Testament example that I might reference later, that it's referring to God made, or Peter said that God made us to become sons of God. But in every other time that it was referenced in the Old Testament, B'nai Elohim, that term sons of God, B'nai Elohim, is always referring to fallen angels. That term B'nai Elohim is mentioned multiple times in the book of Job, but just for the sake of time, we'll look at one example, Job 1:6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. Now, first of all, for those who are out there who may be listening to me who disagree, on my take of who the sons of God were, and you hold to that Sethite view, I don't understand how anybody could hold to that view after reading this verse and other verses in the book of Job, where God is admonishing Job, where were you when the sons of God, did this and did that? And so, but here in Job 1:6, it says, now when the days, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also with them. So basically, that's automatic. I mean, it should be cut and dry that the sons of God, or the B'nai Elohim, they were supernatural angelic beings. So and then there's those that argue against that, and their main argument, well, angels can't procreate. But again, you're dismissing other passages of scripture that clearly point out the fact that angels have the ability to appear on earth in human form. There are instances, of course, that we all can recall in our own minds of angels appearing on earth where immediately, at least not initially, the people who the angels interacted with did not recognize that they were angels. And another passage in the New Testament says that we should always be on alert, because we could be entertaining angels unaware. So angels have the ability to take on human form and human traits and human characteristics. And I don't think there's much question about that from a scriptural standpoint. So we're gonna just assume that the sons of God that's mentioned in Genesis chapter 6 are the angels that came and cohabitated with human earthly women. Now, what happened? A careful examination of Genesis 6 seems to suggest that somehow there was a physical union between fallen angels and human women. The unnatural offspring of this union were the Nephilim. And so, of course, this again is also will put the question, if you hold to the Sethite view, the sons of God being, Sethite on a godly line, which, of course, I mean, it's just, I don't understand how anybody could hold that view or that perspective. But the fact is, in addition to what we've already pointed out, is that the offspring of that union between the sons of God and earthly women produced some genetically freakish individuals that became giants. In other words, the genome of the offspring became hybrids of this union between human and fallen angels. And so we're going to look, and then of course we're going to have other evidence that I'm getting ready to go into, and I just have a few minutes now. The word Nephilim, directly transliterated from the Hebrew, is translated as giants. So the King James says that there were giants in the land. Other translations refer to them as the Nephilim, and you'll hear that term often, Nephilim, also giants. And so it could not have been, obviously it could not have been the line of Seth, because at this particular time there were nobody else godly that God said it was on earth. It was gotten so bad he wanted to wipe everybody out, and so obviously that could not have been the case. But again, you had this genetic this genetic disorder of this offspring becoming giants, and so obviously that could only have been with non-human interaction with other humans. That's the only way that the type of where you had wide-ranging giants that roam the earth, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Also, Genesis 6 describes the Nephilim as heroes of old, men of renown. Apparently, one of the consequences of this union, according to the Genesis 6 narrative, was that the wickedness of man became great on the earth. So two things are there in that particular component. First of all, these giants became heroes of old, men of renown. And just let me stick a pin right there, because when I was a kid, I wasn't saved. I got saved when I was mid-20s. But I used to be a big fan of Greek mythology. And here to come to find out later in life, as I began to study and I got saved and I began to study ancient history and so forth, I began to realize that, and I've been studying this Nephilim story for quite a while now, but I began to realize that these heroes of old, we used to think, and many people still think, that the mythology or the Greek mythology, the Greek gods, Zeus, Apollo, that they were just myths, Hercules, and on, the different Greek gods. But now it is plausible to think or to surmise that they were actual individuals who were Nephilim, but the Greeks, deified them as gods. And so that's another story. I may do an entire study on that just separately at some other point. But I'm just going to bypass that. I wanted to just kind of throw that out there, give you something to think about, just kind of challenge your, get those synapses, those mental synapses firing on all cylinders. So that's kind of what we're trying to do here. But then it also says that wickedness of man was great on the earth. Wickedness of man was great on the earth. Now let's move forward. Now let's look at beginning with Genesis chapter 6, verses 3 through 7. And notice what it says. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he has also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. And so, of course, he's projecting forward because God already knows, because the lifespan at this particular moment, because this is pre-flood when God is speaking here. And so, the lifespans were much longer than that. But obviously, he can see into the future because he can see the beginning from the end. So God already knows that this flood is coming because he had already warned and already prophesied through Enoch, which we're going to see here in a moment. Now, and then verse 4 says there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, the same became mighty men, the same mighty men which were of old, men of renown. So that so basically what we had here is we had a union, we had some genetic some genetic freakish results, some genetic abnormalities that resulted from this unholy union that took place, that led up to the flood. Now, mind you, God had not yet sent the flood waters yet, so he's building up to it. Now, I remember we talked a little bit about, I mentioned, and I put a lot of emphasis, I talked about Enoch. And I'm going to probably close out here with this for tonight, and then just pick it up here next week. This might be a good place to kind of let it rest and let some of this marinate, and we'll pick it back up next week. But why would I even be bothering talking about the book of Enoch or the stories from Enoch? Because Enoch, and I can hear, even though I can't see you, I can hear some of the facial expressions now. Why is he talking about Enoch? Enoch is not in the Bible. Well, here's two things I want to just point out about the book of Enoch. Yes, this in fact, Enoch is not was not canonized, rather, excuse me, and it's not part of our canon. This is, we all can agree with that. However, in the first century, especially, Enoch, the book of Enoch, was viewed as history. In other words, they even though they didn't feel like it was divinely inspired per se, but it was viewed as history. It was historical. And not only was it historical, but it was directly quoted in the New Testament. So in other words, as we're going to see here going forward, that Jude in his letter quotes directly from the book of Enoch. Also, Peter, he quotes directly from the book of Enoch. When we get into the book of Revelation, there are other quotes directly from the book of Enoch. And the term "son of man" is we don't see that anywhere we don't see that in the too often in the Old Testament, but we see it in the book of Enoch. And so another reason why to garner information from the book of Enoch, would be vital for us if we want to like be more scholarly is that many of you maybe be familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Book of Enoch was or manuscripts from the Book of Enoch was among the Dead Sea Scrolls, right along with Isaiah and Ezekiel and other Old Testament manuscripts. The Book of Jubilees, which is another one, the Book of Jasher, that's another one that's not canonized, but it was viewed by the ancient Israelites as canonical. I mean, I'm sorry, it's historical. And they thought so much of it that not only did some of the New Testament writers quote it and directly verbatim, but also those who are responsible for storing the Dead Sea Scrolls thought enough of the content of the Book of Enoch to include it in the sacred scrolls that they put in the cave in Qumran that we know as the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's very, very important to keep that in mind. And then going forward, we've got to talk a little bit more about the Book of Enoch. And then the Book of Enoch tells the story, and I keep telling myself I'm getting ready to stop, but I'm going to stop here in just a moment. But the Book of Enoch tells the story of the Watchers and those fallen angels. In other words, maybe I can put it this way: we have in in 7 verses in Genesis chapter 6, kind of gives us a whole, it's got kind of a thumbnail briefing of what happened, with these fallen angels that cohabitated with human women. But the Book of Enoch gives an in-depth, detailed account from beginning to end. He even goes far as to name each individual watcher. He also says what happened. He goes all into specific detail, and it talks about how Enoch was sent in order to pronounce judgment on the watchers, and how the watchers came to Enoch in order to try to persuade Enoch to go to God and intercede for them on their behalf and try to see if they can be forgiven. And Enoch went and came back and let them know, no forgiveness for you guys. It's a wrap. So the Enoch goes a blow by blow, in-depth detail of what Genesis 6 only gives a thumbnail sketch about. So that's the reason why it's important. And then there's virtually no contradiction in any way, shape, or form between what's recorded in Genesis 6 and what's recorded in the book of First Enoch. And so next week, we're going to begin to unpack some of that. And let's just look a little bit more. The book of Enoch, a righteous man as a messenger who is given the task of delivering God's judgment to the watchers for their sins. Now, let me talk a little bit about who the watchers were. The watchers were, they were actual angels that fall into 2 categories. You have the godly watchers that's recorded in the book of Daniel, chapter 6. They're mentioned 3 times in the book of Daniel. We'll point that out here probably next week. And but then you have the fallen watchers, and they're also mentioned in the book of Enoch by name. And so we're going to unpack that next week. And just real quick, the book of Enoch and the watchers are depicted as a group of angels who descend to earth, take human wives, and father the Nephilim, leading to widespread corruption. And so in other words, it's because of the deeds and the sins of the watchers that the evil was on earth to such an extent. And one of the things, and I'll close with this for tonight, one of the things that the watchers did, or the main thing, is that as individual watchers, they began to teach humanity knowledge that was forbidden. It was called forbidden knowledge. For example, they taught how to make war, how to make weapons, how to do metallurgy. I mean, I used to always wonder why is it that cultures all over the world understood how to do metallurgy? Well, that can always all be traced back to the watchers, and then later to the knowledge that was passed on, after the Tower of Babel. So that's all, that narrative was very interesting. But they taught them how to dig for metals out of the earth and smelt them and make weapons, and how to make war, and how to all different type that taught them astronomy and the movement of the stars. And Enoch specifically points out that all of this was knowledge that was not intended for man to have, at least at that time, because sin, was still, was still matriculating, and the effects of sin. And it was not God's will for man, at least at that time, to obtain all of this heavenly knowledge. And once the watchers realized that they, had given off this knowledge, in addition to cohabitating with women, I mean, that was bad enough, because they were going to be condemned for that just alone. But then the idea of teaching humanity all of this forbidden knowledge and science, that became pretty much an end for them. So I'm going to stop right there, and we're going to end our session for tonight. We're going to pick it up right there next week, and we're going to talk about more detail about the flood of Noah, the impact of the watchers. And anybody, if you're interested, there's some very good information online that you can look up about the watchers, and maybe you can kind of like get an idea where I'm going, because these watchers were mentioned by name and exactly what their sin was in the book of Enoch. And so we're going to unpack that, and then we're going to talk about the flood and a little bit more about the impact of the flood. And hopefully we can start on next week. We will finish up the flood of Noah and start on looking at the Tower of Babel account. So until next week, I hope we got something out of this lesson. So until next week, God bless everybody, and hope to see you again next week. God bless.